On December 8, 1941, the United States was focused on the smoking wreckage of the battleships in Pearl Harbor. But in the backrooms of Washington, logistical experts were panicking about something far more dangerous than the Japanese Navy. They realized that the modern American way of life and the modern way of war was about to hit a brick wall. The United States, the greatest industrial power on Earth, had effectively run out of rubber overnight. This is the story of the Great Rubber Crisis of 1942, the forgotten emergency that almost cost the Allies the war. It is a story of desperation, scientific alchemy, and why the government made you drive at 35 miles per hour to save democracy. To understand the crisis, you have to look at the biology of the Hevea brasiliensis tree. Natural rubber comes from a white, milky sap that bleeds from this specific tree when you cut the bark. In 1941, the United States consumed over 600,000 tons of rubber annually, more than half of the world's supply. We used it for everything: car tires, electrical insulation, hoses, gaskets, and fan belts. But here was the strategic nightmare. 97% of that rubber came from Southeast Asia. Specifically, it came from the plantations of British Malaya and the Dutch East Indies. When the Japanese launched their Blitzkrieg across the Pacific in early 1942, they didn't just bomb islands. They systematically captured the world's rubber supply, cutting off the lifeline of the Western world. Within 3 months, the Japanese army controlled 90% of the world's natural rubber production. The price of rubber didn't just go up, the supply simply ceased to exist. President Roosevelt was told by his advisors that without rubber, the war was already lost. A modern army does not roll on steel, it rolls on rubber. Let's look at the military math that terrified the Pentagon. A single Sherman tank requires half a ton of rubber for its track pads and road wheels. A B-17 Flying Fortress bomber requires half a ton of rubber for its massive landing gear tires and self-sealing fuel tanks. A battleship like the USS Iowa requires 75 tons of rubber to insulate its thousands of miles of electrical wiring, and this does not even account for the millions of trucks, jeeps, and ambulances required to move supplies. Without rubber, the tanks would rattle themselves to pieces and the trucks would be stuck in the mud. The United States had a strategic stockpile, but it was dangerously small. At the consumption rate of 1941, the U.S. had enough rubber to last exactly 1 year. After that, the economy would collapse, and the military would be immobilized. The government launched a desperate campaign, America's Rubber Drive. They asked civilians to donate every scrap of old rubber they could find in their homes. People donated garden hoses, old tires, rain boots, and even rubber bath mats. President Roosevelt famously donated his dog's chew toy to the scrap drive as a publicity stunt. Millions of tons of scrap were collected, piling up in massive mountains in town squares. But from an engineering standpoint, this was a failure. Old reclaimed rubber is chemically degraded. It lacks the elasticity and strength of virgin rubber. You cannot build a high-performance aircraft tire out of melted-down garden hoses. It might work for a shoe sole, but on a bomber landing at 100 miles per hour, it would explode. The scrap drive was good for morale, but it was useless for the war effort. The only solution was to invent a new industry from scratch, synthetic rubber. The Germans had already done it. As we discussed in our oil video, they were masters of chemical substitutes. IG Farben had developed Buna-S rubber, made from coal and limestone. But in the United States, the technology was in its infancy. Standard Oil had a partnership with IG Farben before the war. But the technology transfer had been slow and controversial. Now the U.S. government had to take a laboratory experiment and scale it up to $1 billion industry in months. They appointed a rubber czar, William Jeffers, giving him dictatorial powers over the economy to get it done. The recipe for American synthetic rubber was called GRS, Government Rubber Styrene. It was made from 2 primary ingredients, butadiene and styrene. Butadiene is a gas derived from petroleum or alcohol. Styrene is a liquid derived from coal. When you mix them in a massive reactor with soapy water and a catalyst, they polymerize into white crumbs of rubber. It sounds simple, but it required building 51 massive chemical plants across the country. It required steel, copper, and valves that were already needed for building ships and tanks. The rubber czar had to fight the Navy for steel and the Army for high-octane fuel components. It was a brutal internal war of logistics, fought in the boardrooms of Washington. While the factories were being built, the government had to stop the bleeding of the existing stockpile. They couldn't just ask people to drive less, they had to force them. This is the origin of gasoline rationing in the United States. Many people believe gas was rationed because of a fuel shortage. This is a myth. The US had plenty of oil. It was the world's largest oil producer. Gasoline was rationed solely to prevent people from driving and wearing out their tires. If you couldn't buy gas, you couldn't drive. If you couldn't drive, your tires lasted longer. The government printed A, B, and C stickers for windshields to determine your priority. An A sticker allowed you only 3 to 4 gallons a week, barely enough for church and grocery shopping. Truckers and doctors got C or T stickers for unlimited fuel, but they were watched closely. Then came the victory speed limit. The government mandated a national speed limit of 35 miles per hour. This wasn't for safety, it was physics. Tire wear increases exponentially with speed. A tire driven at 60 mph wears out twice as fast as one driven at 35 mph. The FBI actually investigated drivers who sped, treating them essentially as saboteurs. To waste rubber was to help the Axis. But the synthetic rubber program faced a massive technical hurdle, the heat buildup problem. Early synthetic rubber was not as good as natural rubber. When a tire flexes, it generates heat. Natural rubber dissipates this heat efficiently. Synthetic rubber trapped the heat. Inside the thick carcass of a truck tire, the temperature would spike. This caused blowouts. Truck tires made of pure synthetic rubber would simply delaminate and explode on the highway. The engineers had to blend natural rubber with synthetic to create a composite tire that survived. They also needed a new material for the tire cords. Cotton, the standard material, was too weak for the heat. This led to the mass production of rayon, a semi-synthetic fiber that could withstand high temperatures. By 1943, the miracle of production began to take shape. Giant plants in Texas, Louisiana, and West Virginia began churning out white blocks of GRS rubber. In 1941, the U.S. produced only 8,000 tons of synthetic rubber. By 1945, the U.S. was producing 820,000 tons per year. It was an industrial expansion unmatched in human history, even faster than the Manhattan Project. The U.S. had created a new industry, from zero to world leader, in less than 3 years. But the quality struggle continued. Synthetic tires were slippery on wet roads. They chipped and cracked in the cold. Drivers hated them. However, in the context of war, hated but functional is a victory. The synthetic tires kept the Red Ball Express trucks moving towards Berlin. They allowed the B-29 superfortresses to take off from Tinian to bomb Japan. The crisis also forced innovation in other areas, specifically in retreading. Instead of throwing away a bald tire, mechanics learned to vulcanize a new strip of tread onto the old casing. This process saved millions of tons of rubber and is still used in the trucking industry today. There is a dark side to this story, involving the corporate politics of Standard Oil. Before the war, Standard Oil had a deal with Nazi Germany's IG Farben. You stay out of oil, we stay out of chemicals. This cartel agreement delayed the development of synthetic rubber in the U.S. by several years. Harry Truman, then a senator, called this treason. But when the crisis hit, the patents were seized by the government and shared with all manufacturers. Firestone, Goodyear, Goodrich, and U.S. Rubber were forced to work together, sharing secrets they had guarded for decades. It was a unique moment of state capitalism, where the government owned the factories and the corporations ran them. The result was that by 1944 the U.S. was independent of the rubber tree. When the Allies finally liberated the rubber plantations in Malaya in 1945, they found them overgrown and neglected. But it didn't matter anymore. The world had changed. The natural rubber monopoly was broken forever. The price of rubber would never again be dictated by a colonial power or a cartel. This crisis explains why, if you look at a modern tire, it is a complex blend of chemistry. It is a direct descendant of the desperate experiments of 1942. The victory speed limit was lifted in 1945, and Americans went back to driving fast. But the infrastructure of the chemical plants remained, forming the backbone of the post-war plastic boom. The rubber crisis is a perfect example of the industrial war concept. Japan won the tactical battle by capturing the trees. But they lost the strategic war because they underestimated the ability of American chemists to rewrite the laws of supply. They thought that by cutting off the resource they would stop the machine. Instead, they forced the machine to evolve. The US didn't just find a new source of rubber, they invented one. So the next time you kick the tires of your car, remember the panic of 1942. Remember the bath mats melted down for tank treads and the speed limits enforced by the FBI. It was the moment when chemistry became just as important as ballistics, and it proved that in a total war, the scientist in the lab coat is just as lethal as the soldier in the trench.